This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Pastors at seminary are not taught that the Nephilim, the giants of Genesis 6, are literal hybrid creatures, semi-divine, semi-human. So why do we think so? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. That'll be our topic for Iron and Myth program number 31. And joining us for our monthly roundtable, well, two of our three regular guests, as Dr. Judd Burton is trying to sort out a connection that will let him log into our little studio here. But as you will see, we've got reasons for believing as we do. Doug Van Dorn, author of Giants, Sons of the Gods, and the pastor of the Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado in Boulder. You go to his church, you can actually hear preaching on Genesis 6 from time to time. And Brian Godawa, who has taken this message into the realm of fiction and nonfiction, author of Chronicles of the Nephilim, but also When Giants Were Upon the Earth and When Watchers Ruled the Nations. As for me, Sharon and I have collaborated on Giants, Gods, and Dragons, so you get an idea of where we're coming from. But the question is, why is the consensus in seminary not that? Gentlemen, welcome. Brian, you've dug into some of the reasons, the arguments against understanding the Nephilim, the giants of Genesis chapter 6, as literal giants and hybrid creatures. I guess I've had my head in the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6 for so long. It sort of seems like, why would anybody view this any other way?
Yeah.
What are the arguments against that interpretation?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why we've been doing this sort of little mini series of debunking, or at least addressing counter viewpoints, is, I think it's important for myself when I'm researching interpretations of biblical things, scriptural things. We have to acknowledge that within orthodoxy, there are often multiple interpretations of theological concepts. And to be fair, to be honest with ourselves, but also to be fair to listeners, to be fair to others, I think it sometimes behooves us to take the time to address objections or address viewpoints that disagree with us, because otherwise then you're just propagandizing. And, there's nothing wrong inherently with, promoting a single viewpoint. You need the time and all that. But it's important sometimes to take the time out and address those objections. And I know that myself, as a reader of these things, I often find myself, I'll read a viewpoint, and if I agree with them, I'm like, yeah, but what about these questions? How did you answer that? Because I know other people who say this, So that's our goal in doing this. And, we've already dealt with Sons of God, and what else have we dealt with? Psalm 82.
Psalm 82, and other passages related to it that deal with the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, right?
Yeah. Well, the other elephant in the room in these issues is, of course, the Nephilim. And, again, I'll try my best. I probably won't hit all the points, and you guys can fill this out if I miss something, of course. But I'm going to try to at least run through a quick sort of expression of how a non-supernatural, non-giant oriented interpretation of Nephilim, what their basic arguments are, so that we can hopefully, address some of those things. And of course, we get back to Genesis 6, but there's only two places in the Bible where the word Nephilim actually shows up, and that's in Genesis 6 and Numbers 32 and 13, and it's two places in Numbers. The word shows up twice in that verse, those couple of verses. So if we go back to the origin story type of thing, we're back to that Genesis 6, 1-4, and I'll just read it in context. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And just starting off with that verse, the non-giant interpretation of Nephilim usually also believes that the sons of God are, human, either divine, dynastic kings or people from the line of Seth, right? But we've already addressed the sons of God issue, and it's still relevant in some of our answers when we give the answers. But nonetheless, they usually interpret the sons of God as humans, and then there's different ways that they approach this. But first of all, they usually say that the word Nephilim, the word is a plural word, for Nephil, but that word means to fall or fallen ones. That's what they'll say, and therefore it doesn't necessarily mean giants. And in fact, they'll say sometimes that the reason why the Septuagint was translated as giants is because Septuagint had some Hellenistic influence from Greek mythology that biased them to translate it that way. That's what they'll say. But the main idea here is that they say, look, it means fallen ones, okay? And it says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward when the sons of God came in. It doesn't say that the Nephilim are the offspring. It just says that they were on the earth in those days when the sons of God were doing that. That's the first thing they try to say. And then secondly, because the verse doesn't literally say that they are their offspring, right? Then they'll say, and these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And that's, we've talked about this where the mighty men, that word is Gibborim, and it basically means mighty warriors. And they'll say, well, look, they're saying that the Nephilim, who are they? Well, they're not giants, they're Gibborim, mighty warriors. And if you look at that Gibborim word later on in the Bible, you'll see that it's used of other mighty warriors who are not giants like David's men, right? David had mighty men. So it's just saying, so what it's saying is if there's any giant aspect to this concept, it's more like giant in stature in terms of their reputation or their glory. It's like those are giant, mighty warriors of old. It's just a way of expressing greatness or mightiness in being warriors. Let's see. So that's sort of as far as I see. Those are some of the arguments that they give for Genesis 1-6. And then they'll go to Numbers 13:32, which we've addressed many times, and that verse, I'll go to that to read it. Numbers 13:32, and then so this is talking about the spies coming in from the land and with Joshua and Caleb and the spies, and it says that they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. Now, there's a couple different ways that they address this language. Again, they'll say, this is, saying like we're like grasshoppers. That's not literal, obviously, right? It's hyperbolic because they're not like grasshoppers. And again, they'll say these phrases, saying of great height, they are also phrases that are used elsewhere in the Bible that are just simply saying these are great men. And this is a metaphor, saying of great height is a metaphor for their mightiness, their warrior, right? It's not literal. Another thing that they'll say is that in fact, specifically the Hebrew Ansi Midot, which means of great measure. These are men of great measure. They would say that that's where it's a reference to greatness, not literal size. So they are of great measure is a metaphor. But also they'll say that the bad report is the key to understanding this. These guys are not telling the truth. They're exaggerating because they're afraid, right, to go into the promised land. And that's what it means when they say they gave a bad report, which means they're not telling the truth. They're exaggerating or they're lying. And so consequently, whatever that terminology used in that definition is not to be trusted. So, I'm sure, maybe you guys can fill that out, but that's sort of the basic, from what I've seen, that's sort of the basic approach that they'll use to interpret Nephilim, not as literal giants, but as just simply a metaphor for great warriors.
Doug, you're the ordained pastor here. What did you hear when you came to that part of Genesis in your schooling?
Well, if I even remember them talking about it, it would have been completely the natural the naturalistic view. And that's a barely if I remember. I mean, I think probably it was brought up, but it was nothing that would make me go, what? It was completely ordinary, normal. And that's pretty stock for most evangelical and Reformed schools around our country.
What was it that changed your mind?
It was reading Mike's book, The Myth That Is True, when he was giving that away for free online back in the day before it became the Unseen Realm. And, I wasn't even expecting to read about giants or anything like that when I came across that book. This was just a book that he was giving out, and I had read his little article on Deuteronomy 32 that we brought up last time. And I was just so intrigued by it, and found out that this guy was going to UFO conferences and giving biblical theology as like a missions apologetic sort of thing. I was just so fascinated. I said I want to read whatever I can from this guy. He was giving that book away, and to his peeps on his on his webpage.
Yeah, I've got an external drive somewhere that's got a copy of that.
Yeah, I was so geeked out about that, I actually created an index for it. So that's pretty nerdy.
It was surprising to me to find out, and I credit Ryan Pitterson with this, in reading his books, The Final Nephilim, Judgment of the Nephilim. I hope I got the name of the book right. He cites a lot of theologians from the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries who do have that supernatural understanding of Genesis chapter 6, because I had been under the impression that it had been lost until just recently, that after Augustine in the 5th century, that teaching had been abandoned by Christian theologians. And maybe it has, at least as far as what's being taught in seminary, but it seems that Bible scholars, starting in the beginning of the 20th century, and they, just because they're Bible scholars doesn't mean they believe that what's in the Bible is the actual Word of God, but their consensus anyway seems to be that the Hebrew prophets understood Genesis 6 to mean what we interpret, that this was a divine human hybrid that was created, and the Hebrews did believe that they were giants. So that seems to be the theological consensus of Bible scholars, but for some reason it's not being taught to pastors in seminary.
Yeah, Willem van Gemeren wrote an article. He's been dead now for probably 20 years or whatever, but he wrote an article on the demythologizing of places like Genesis 6 as a fairly recent phenomenon. And so, to me, that really hits well with the isms that you find in the 19th century that were all so naturalistic. So to hear that that there was a supernatural interpretation that was still in the churches prior to that doesn't really surprise me. And it would probably, if they were Reformed, coming from a Calvin or Lutheran tradition, especially because so many of those guys really just followed what the original writers were talking about. But not everybody came from that tradition.
One of the books that I've read that you turned me on to, Doug, is the doctoral dissertation by Jaap Dodens, who's a scholar. Is he Swedish or Danish?
He's he's Dutch, I think.
Dutch, okay. But his doctoral dissertation was on the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, and he points out that there was a German scholar in the 19th century, who late 19th, early 20th century, who basically turned Christian theology back to a supernatural interpretation of Genesis chapter 6. But again, that doesn't seem to have worked its way into seminaries, because it's certainly not the majority view of pastors in the pulpit, which is why this is so new when a lot of people hear it. And I knew it was new to me. It's worse than that, Derek. It was new to me when I first heard it.
Yeah, it's actually worse than that in some places. I know two professors in two different seminaries that were at one level or another teaching the supernatural view of Genesis 6. And when the word got back to those who were in charge of the seminary, both of them were called into the office, and they were told explicitly, "You will not teach that in this school."
This
So
really strikes
ironic
me
if
as
you think
odd.
about it.
Yeah, it is so ironic, right?
It's ironic because like the human view, interpretation, is actually following the atheistic demythologizing. Their
Right.
fear
And
of mythology
yeah,
is their drive to demythologize everything,
yeah.
and that clearly comes from an atheistic 19th century, worldview. And wow, you know,
Well, and especially if you take any kind of a scripture is supposed to be our base for our theology. I know that a lot of folks go to the extra biblical text, but you don't have to do that in order to demonstrate this view. And if you just are looking at the scripture and talking about it that way, if scripture is supposed to be your final arbiter and you're not even allowed to talk about it, that's problematic.
Yeah. It is interesting, the tack that is taken sometimes by people who just don't want to accept this understanding of who the giants of Genesis 6 were, and ontologically, I mean, semi-human, semi-divine, that can't be. There's no place in the Bible that says angels can do that. Well, yeah, right there in Genesis 6, that's exactly what it says. Well, except for that. But that doesn't count because, okay, well...
yeah, because angels can't have sex.
Right.
No,
Because Jesus said they don't get married.
It's just so funny, how people have these assumptions and they don't even realize you're begging the question. That means when you are assuming the very thing that's in question, you're just asserting your dogmatic ignorance, or shall we say, to be fair, your dogmatic commitments.
One of the things that, and this is one of the reasons Sharon and I do this in our weekly Bible study, when we read the Old Testament, we follow along. Whoever's reading, we alternate chapters. We switch. The other person will be reading along in the Septuagint translation, which was produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. The Greek rulers of Alexandria, who'd taken over after the death of Alexander the Great, wanted to understand what their subject peoples in the land of Judea were what they believed. And so these Jewish scholars translated what we call the Old Testament into the Septuagint. And it's clear when you looked, I can't believe, we talked about this last week, I can't believe that I had never done this previously. I just did a word search for the word giant in the Septuagint. These are Jewish religious scholars, 3rd century BC. What do they believe about their scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament to us Gentiles? Genesis chapter 6. Now giants were upon the earth in those days. Those were the giants who were from long ago, the people of renown. Numbers 13:34. There we have seen the giants, and we were compared to them like locusts. But you also see the word giants applied to the word Rephaim, and the understanding that the Rephaim were either the descendants of the giants or the spirits of the giants destroyed in the flood of Noah. Joshua 12, verse 4, Og, king of Bashan, remained out of the giants. In the English translation, it's Rephaim. 2 Kings 21:11, Dan, son of Joah, who was from the descendants of the giants, took them down. 2 Kings, it'd be 2 Samuel, actually, 2 Samuel 21. When the Philistine giants that David and his men had to deal with, these 4 were born as descendants of the giants in Gath, descendants of the Rapha in English. We see in Job 26:5, are not giants brought forth from beneath the water and his neighbors? The word in Hebrew is Rephaim. Isaiah 14, verse 9. This one I think is really interesting. Hades below was embittered after meeting you. This is Sheol rises up to greet you. All the giants who ruled the land, who roused all the kings of the nations from their thrones, rose together with you. Isaiah 14, that's the famous chapter in the King James that, how art thou fallen, O Lucifer, son of the morning. Isaiah 14,
I believe
9.
Don't they translate that in the ESV as shades?
Shades,
Yeah.
yes.
So even the ESV is actually giving a supernatural translation on that, although it's a little bit different. But
a
still.
weak one. Yeah.
Shades is, because you can make the interpretation that the shades are the human dead, but the word in Hebrew is Rephaim. And again, here in Isaiah 14, it's clear they say, the Septuagint, these were the giants who ruled the land, who roused all the kings of the nations from their thrones. In other words, the mighty men who were of old. So again,
Let's
and we
talk
see
about
this in
the word
Ezekiel
Nephilim.
32. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Mike Heiser did a great translation of that. He pointed out in his, and it's funny because you can find it at the website sitchiniswrong.com, which is his rebuttal of Zechariah Sitchin and the idea that the Anunnaki were ancient space travelers from the planet Nibiru. But he really explains in detail why the word Nephilim does not derive from the verb meaning to fall, but is rather an Aramaic loanword, naphil or naphilah, that literally means giant. And without getting into the language geek stuff, Mike makes it very clear. This is a word that in Aramaic to this day, naphilah, is the name for the constellation Orion, the giant.
By the way, the clincher for that is Numbers 13:32 has the word Nephilim twice in it.
Twice.
And one of them is the Hebrew spelling and the other one is the Aramaic spelling, which means that in the eyes of the writer, the Aramaic is the same as the Hebrew in terms of its meaning. So therefore it's giant.
Yeah.
But also, I was going to say, also it's Septuagint, you're reading all the giant, the gigantes and stuff. So the argument that they were Greek influenced Hellenists, therefore they were influenced by Greek mythology, that actually works against the arguer. And the reason why is I would say that no, what it means is because they were familiar in the ancient world, they thought differently than we did. They weren't afraid of something in the Bible that looked similar to other mythologies because that didn't disprove anything to them. It only showed a common truth, differently interpreted, right? And so consequently, to me, it makes more sense that the Gigantes, translation of the Septuagint is a more accurate understanding in the ancient world context. So therefore, your rejection of the mythology is your own modern bias. And think about it. If you were to apply that consistently, well, then you'd have to say the flood was just mythology because all the other religions have flood myths. Right. And there's a lot of things in common. We've seen all the various elements of Noah's story that are also common in other stories. Well, then you'd have to say, well, then it's mythology and it's not true. Well, no, because the Bible has no problem with having some common sources or some, shall we say, similarities between other ancient stories. But the Bible gives its own truth spin to what these other ancient religions have their false spins on, right? And so to me, it makes more sense if it would be similar to the mythology because that's showing, like I said, that's showing the commonality. So gigantes does seem to make sense in terms of translation.
And it is a mythological word. I mean, that's by definition, that's what they are.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the word Tartarus when Peter uses that as the word for hell to talk about the place where they were locked up in their chains in prison. Like if most of the English translations will translate it as hell, but it's not Hades and it's not Gehenna. It's a word that's used only one time, and it necessarily has overlaps with Greek mythology. He chose that word for a reason.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Brian, you bring this up because to me, and I'd like to know what you guys think about this, but when you're making an argument that it sounds too mythological and so it can't be true, that actually, isn't that exactly what liberal scholarship has been doing for 150 years? Isn't that literally their argument that the Bible is full of myths and so that these mythological people were having troubles like stamping out their older myths and so they couldn't figure out if they had believed in one God or many gods and then these monotheistic Jews came along and tried to stamp out as much of it as they could, but they couldn't get it all, And so that's why the liberals use it as a way, most of them, I would say, to show that this is why you can't trust the Bible. And so when a conservative comes along and uses the same argument, I'm like, what are you doing? Doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, which is my argument that modern fundamentalism / also a lot of evangelicalism bought the lie, the modernist lie of the early 20th century. The fight against fundamentalism, while it was a good, honorable fight
against liberalism.
Liberalism. I'm sorry.
The fundamentalists joined up with the all the different branches of conservative Christianity,
Yes.
which included fundamentalists, came together to fight against liberal theology, and out of that came the fundamentals that they
Yes.
wrote.
But
Yeah.
part of the paradigm was a false paradigm that's what we're battling with here, which is this hyperliteralism, where they, just like atheists will read the Bible and they'll read it hyperliterally in order to see how it's nonsense. It doesn't prove it's false. It's ridiculous. And so, many evangelicals have taken up that same standard. Okay, so then how can we prove that everything in the Bible is literally hyperliterally true? And that itself is, you've already lost the game, because you've accepted their premise, which is not true at all.
Well, and you can't be consistent with it. And we've already brought up, you brought up a couple of different passages where when it says giants, the very same people that kind of do that hyper-literalistic thing are saying, well, that's not to be taken literally at all. It's metaphorical.
Exactly.
I'd like to deal with that. First let's stay with Genesis 6. So the other element here is that they will say that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. The Nephilim are not the offspring of the sons of God coming into the daughters of men. Mm-hmm. How would you guys address that? It's just saying they coexist.
Yeah, I mean, so why, if that's what it's going on, then it's almost just like it's just coming out of the blue, and it's not really part of the story. Because as you're reading the text, first verse, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them. So you have these births going on, and the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And then verse 4, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And just like, well, why are you telling me that? And then it's not even finished with the sentence. It's still within a comma. When the sons of God came into the daughters of man and children were born to them. Why would you sit here and tell me about all this birth going on between these two different groups and then insert a progeny, but it has nothing to do with those births that you're telling me about?
Well,
and
let's go
furthermore,
back
you're not even telling me about the births that are happening. Like, why would that? I don't understand that logic.
Yeah, you're trying to explain it away. But again, it's based on the English translation. How did the Jews of the 3rd century, how did the Jewish religious scholars understand it? Here's the English translation of the Greek Septuagint. Now giants were upon the earth in those days, and after that, whenever the sons of God entered into the daughters of humans, they fathered children for themselves. Those were the giants who were from long ago the people of renown. It seems clear to me that the Jews understood that was what had happened there. And certainly that's made explicit by the Jews who wrote the book of First Enoch around the same time that the Septuagint was being translated.
Not only that, but remember, people, Jesus and the apostles quoted the Septuagint.
That's
so
right.
you can't, we can argue on a text critical basis. There are problems with the Septuagint at times, and there are problems with the Masoretic text at times, and that has to, you have to do a deep study and all this. But in general, you can't dismiss the Septuagint. If the apostles and Jesus are quoting it, you have to take it seriously. And if you're going to deny the interpretation, you're going to have to show some pretty powerful exegetical gymnastics to do so, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'll give you a specific example of this. Hebrews chapter 2, for whatever reason, I was kind of doing a deep dive on what is the message that the angels delivered in Hebrews chapter 2. I was talking with Derek a little bit earlier this week about this, and everybody assumes that message is that the angels were somehow interceding with the law of Moses, because Stephen talks about that in Acts 7, and Paul talks about that in Galatians 3. And in those two places, it's very clear that he's talking about angelic intercession of the law. But Hebrews is using very, very different language for this. And the entire surrounding context on both sides of this are all of these quotations of the Psalms about angels, and they're all from the Septuagint.
Huh. Very interesting.
And, and into that, we can go a little further with it, just as it's related to this, because the Septuagint is where we find the sons of God being translated as angels. So that's relevant to the discussion, because it's not just that angels is coming out of nowhere. This was the translation that these guys were using for whatever reasons to translate sons of God, is in this heavenly interpretation. So those Psalms have as their context, I would argue probably every single one of those 10 or so Psalms that are quoted are somehow related to the divine counsel. So it's just very interesting that you bring up the Septuagint part of this. You guys do both, and that we can actually go to a specific 2 chapters where that's all it's quoting is the Septuagint.
And Hebrews chapter 2 is just filled with, it's filled with divine counsel references.
Yeah, all over the place.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I found interesting was that one of the early church fathers seemed very much aware of what the Greeks and Romans believed about the giants. The gigantomachy, the war between the giants and the gods. And Doug, I think I may have clipped this from your book, because you cited a lot of these references by the early church fathers. Pseudo Clement, which is dated to the 3rd or 4th century, so named because it was attributed to Clement, but Clement was, late 1st, early 2nd century? Anyway, chapter 15 of Pseudo Clement, but from their unhallowed intercourse, spurious men sprang, much greater in stature than ordinary men, who they afterwards called giants. Not those dragon-footed giants who waged war against God, as those blasphemous myths of the Greeks do sing, but wild in manners and greater than men in size, inasmuch as they were sprung of angels. And then he goes on from there. So, because when you look at, say, the great altar of Zeus from Pergamum, there is a carving, or a frieze of the gigantomachy on one side, and you see that all of the giants are depicted as having serpentine lower appendages. Mm-hmm. And so Pseudo Clement here is making a claim and saying, no, these were real dudes, much bigger because they're half angel, bigger than men because they were sprung of angels, smaller than angels because they came from women. And he goes on from there. So they understood, the Greeks have these myths about them, but those are twisted. That's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I remember writing that, as you bring it up, Derek, in the Giant book. I had a whole section on how you had this was a universal depiction of these characters, that they had human torsos and serpentine legs. Right. You find this in China, you find this in India, you find this in Scandinavia, you find this in Mesoamerica, you find this in Egypt, you find it in Babylon, you find it in Greece. And it's kind of like, what's going on there? Why would you do that? And it's important to remember that just speaking about what a watcher is, they are deeply connected with serpents in all kinds of different ways, whether it's from the divination, the crossing over, to the way that they're depicted in several different pseudepigrapha as looking serpentine in appearance, the visage of a viper, dragon-like in appearance, to Genesis 3, where the serpent is, called a serpent, and we actually think that it's a talking snake or something, but it's really, this is a way to depict these watcher beings. So if you have a human torso and serpentine legs, it's like, what better way to draw something that would be a half-breed if you were trying to communicate that's what these creatures are.
Right.
And that, by the way, if you do, accept the translation of the word as giant, that's the only way that the half-breed, half human, half angel is the only way to make sense of it. Because if the sons of God are not angels, then how could just humans mating with women, how could that breed giants that are very specifically related to those people, unless there's something magically different about them, right?
Yeah, and I've never actually heard anybody, I don't know if you guys have, try to answer that question from a Sethite sort of a view that,
no, I haven't.
You get people that will try and argue about that the Nephilim means fallen ones, but they're not addressing the fact that Goliath is 10 feet tall and Og's bed is 13 feet long, and the depictions not only of the spies in Numbers 13, but of the Anakim in Joshua and in Deuteronomy chapter 2. Several different times these tribes are called giant of stature. Like, those are not in the context of spies lying. So, and and let alone all the traditions and the stories that you hear. Josephus talking about how big they were, and Clement talking about it. Like, I don't know how you could possibly address this, because we've all kind of said before that we probably all know Christians that have married non-Christians, and I don't know any of us that know giants that are universally coming as the product of those marriages.
Yeah, yeah. And something else about the metaphor thing. It's like, yes, there are metaphors, but if you have to also take the metaphors in context. For instance, Numbers 13, it talks about the land devours its inhabitants. So there's the sort of that. We also know Enoch talks about that, right? But it says they saw them, they are of great height, and we observed ourselves like grasshoppers. Those are not metaphor. Grasshopper is not a metaphor. It's a metaphor of size. It's not a metaphor of greatness, right? But even more specifically, in the other locations like Deuteronomy 1 and 2, it says it gives the language that precludes only speaking of greatness. So it says, for example, in Deuteronomy, when all of them, 128 says, the people are greater and taller than we, the sons of the Anakim, greater and taller. It's not saying like just they're taller as a metaphor for greatness. They're greater, they're taller. In Deuteronomy 2:10, the Emim live there, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. So again, you've got multiple expressions of they're a lot in number, they're tall, they're also great. So you can't say that this is just a metaphor for greatness, like the mighty men of old type of thing, but that their greatness is obviously connected and part of this height factor. And I think there's another place too where it comes out. Deuteronomy 2:20. The land of the Rephaim former lived there. The Ammonites called them Zamzumim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. This is sort of a phrase that keeps being repeated. So that's my argument against the saying they're large or size is just a metaphor for greatness. No, it's encompassing more factors than that.
So the equation here would be that just from a logical standpoint, calling them giants or calling them Rephaim suggests greater stature, I should say. It's clear that the Jewish translators, the religious scholars who translated the Septuagint saw it that way. But we also know that the Canaanite neighbors of the Israelites venerated these spirits thanks to the discovery of those Rephaim texts at Ugarit 100 years ago. I think they've only been translated within the last 40 or 45 years, but it's clear that they were believed to be these underworld spirits that had some sort of power in the netherworld. In fact, there's a proverb, and I had it in front of me, and now I've switched screens, but there's a proverb that makes reference to one who wanders from the way of good sense will rest in the counsel of, the English translation is the dead, but it's counsel of the Rephaim, and that echoes Ugaritic texts, Canaanite texts, that talk about these underworld spirits, the assembly of the Rephaim, the assembly or the council of the Ditanu, which is that ancient Amorite tribe that is the origin of the name Titan in the Greek religion, because the Greeks basically got their veneration of the demigods like Heracles and Perseus from their eastern neighbors, from the eastern Mediterranean, from the Canaanites, the Amorites. So these giants were not just humans of exceptional stature. There was something special about them that made them more powerful, and their spirits continued to be venerated after their death. That 1999 paper by Amar Anus, Were There Greek Rephaim, where he showed that the origin of the term used by Homer and Hesiod for the demigods who lived during the Golden Age was the same root behind the Canaanite word Rapayuma or Rephaim. And it's like, to me, that was like mind-boggling. It's like, wow.
So very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you've got really respected scholars like
Derek,
Nicholas Wyatt.
Yeah, go ahead with the Nicholas Wyatt thing, because that's important.
Nicholas Wyatt, who's a professor emeritus, University of Edinburgh, who's done a lot of research and writing on the Ugaritic texts and the overlap with Hebrew religion and the Hebrew Bible has come to accept Amar Anus's explanation in some of his papers. So he's kind of validated that overlap. I mean, the Tadanu or Ditanu of the ancient Amorites, who were later venerated as this group of underworld spirits connected to the Rephaim. That's where the Greeks got the name of their underworld gods who were, banished to Tartarus. And there was some kind of connection between the Tadanu and the Rephaim. Well, that would make sense if the Rephaim spirits of the Rephaim were the giants who'd been fathered by these Tadanu, titans of the ancient world. To me, I think this was just mind-blowing. This ought to be in every church. It's like, hey, your kids are following Percy Jackson and the Olympians. Let's talk about that, and explain why the Bible's a lot more exciting than we've been teaching it to this point. Because that story is here in Scripture. When Paul was, going out and battling demons, when Jesus was casting out demons left, right, and center, he was battling the giants. And we can show it. We know that the Israelites were surrounded by people who venerated these spirits, and that's what all of this eating forbidden food, Isaiah's condemnation of eating forbidden food amongst the tombs was all about. The whole cult of veneration of the dead. It was connected to the Nephilim, whose spirits were later called Rephaim by the Israelites and their neighbors.
I think we can add one more thing to this, Derek. You can talk a little bit more about this. They're all set it up for you. And that's the idea of cosmic geography, sacred geography, and especially as it concerns the area of Galilee and the Bashan. And I remember the first time I read this in Mike's book that Bashan means the place of the serpent. And so this is the place where Og, who has that bed, or dolmen, whichever one, but probably a bed that is 13 feet long, and happens, by the way, to match the length of Marduk's bed. Mm-hmm. So that puts him in that same sort of a mythological category. But Og ruled over this whole area of Bashan, from Mount Hermon down south to Galilee, and then out into some of Syria. Huge swath of land. But this is where Jesus' entire northern ministry is located. And when he's doing things like casting Legion out, or, as you've pointed out, going through the valley of the shadow of death and all this kind of stuff, when he's feeding the 5,000, when he's going up top of Mount Hermon, everything that he's doing in that ministry is one way or another related to the supernatural realm. And when I kind of made my Indiana Jones discovery of that serpent mound, it was really because Mike had told us that the place is called the place of the serpent. And I had, for whatever reason, been looking at serpent mounds and all these different things. But when you find that this thing is a tenth of a mile, just a tenth of a mile, you could hit a golf ball from Gilgal Rephaim onto the serpent mound. And then you learn that they're actually building all of this stuff on top of the serpent mound and nothing below it, and that somehow there's this interaction going on between this wheel of the giants and this serpent mound. I mean, and then you learn that they're venerating the dead and the Rephaim at this very place. I mean, that's some pretty crazy cosmic geography. So, and I think that just, you can use that as kind of a side argument to show that what we're talking about in the way that the Scripture's talking about this was a universal understanding in that area of who these people were.
Absolutely. What blew my mind was reading Dr. Mike Freakman's dissertation, which was kind of a challenge because it's in Hebrew, and running it through Google Translate only gets it so far, but discovering through his research, and Mike Freakman spent a day with us, Brian, Doug and Janelle and Sharon and me, with Aaron Lipkin at Gilgal Rephaim. I think he was happy he found some people that actually read his papers. But he spent a day lecturing there, and I seemed to be happy that we were tracking with what he was telling us, that the central core of Gilgal Rephaim was an artificial entrance to the netherworld where the shaman would go in and consult with the dead. And this site dates back to about 3700 BC, based on his research, much older than Stonehenge, and a lot more rock than Stonehenge too, by the way. But he excavated some of the dolmens that were covered with tumuli on the back of that serpent mound, and found that they were just smaller versions of Gilgal Rephaim. It's that, the 5 big concentric circles around a central core. The smaller dolmens up there were maybe 20 feet across and, 8, 10, 14 feet high, but similar construction, concentric rings around a central core. There are at least 3 other sites in the Upper Galilee and the Golan Heights like Gilgal Rephaim. We visited one that's on the bank of the Jordan River, about 2 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It's about a third the size of Gilgal Rephaim, but the same construction, concentric rings around a central core. Mike had an image of another one that's on a training area for the IDF, so we didn't go there. We'll have to ask for permission from the military, and I don't think we'll get it right now. And there's a 4th one that's similar, but it's in the middle of a minefield that's never been cleared, so nobody goes there. But I was not aware that those smaller, what look like tumuli, cairns, like Scottish burials, where you just pile a bunch of rocks on top of the body, those are just smaller versions of Gilgal Rephaim and related to the cult of the dead. And we could, go on and on about that. But the point is, there are more of these dolmens in the Jordan Valley and on the Golan Heights than just about anywhere on planet Earth. There are a bunch in the Caucasus. They're in Korea, Japan. There are some in Ireland and Scotland. There are some here in the U.S. apparently, but there are more of them.
I know because I saw
tighter
Outlander
together. Well, there you go. But there are more of these things clustered tighter together between Mount Hermon and the Dead Sea than anywhere else on Earth, and especially the Golan Heights, which has got like 5,600 according to Dr. Freakman. So.
And it's like, why would you do all this if it's just ordinary, normal people? I mean, this is deeply, profoundly religious, going right into not just the sons of God and the Watchers, but also the whole Nephilim idea.
Yeah. I wanted to also go back to, for those who like the plain reading of the scripture, we tend to go deep and behind the language, and you kind of have to, but for those who are still, need more plain examples in scripture, there is more. First of all, it's important for us to note again that when we say giants, we don't mean 20-foot monsters like you see in the cartoons and the movies. We're talking 6 to 7 feet, basically, and maybe as high as 9, for Goliath we know about. And let's talk about Goliath for a second. That's at least one example that all the people will acknowledge. Okay, he is a giant. And we've talked about, is it 6 feet 9 or is it 9 feet? Either way, they acknowledge he's a giant, and the description of his armor is very specifically oriented towards reinforcing that size. A normal human is not going to have an arm coat of mail that weighs 5,000 shekels of bronze. He's not going to have a shaft of a spear like a weaver's beam and a spear's head weighing 600 shekels of iron. That's a large giant of a man, right? And most people will acknowledge, okay, yeah, there's your example of your giant. Now, it's interesting that there's something about the weaver's beam that there's an argument, and it's pretty good, but that it's sort of like it's a reference to the kind of javelin it is, not the size of it. But I still think contextually it wouldn't make a lot of sense to me if they were focusing on the kind of javelin, as if when he's talking about all these things to emphasize largeness, and all of a sudden he talks about just some weird, unique kind of javelin. So I would argue that the spear like a weaver's beam is talking about the sizeness of it. So we all acknowledge that. Well, then you look at these places where we have the, Derek mentioned this, the descendants of the giants, and we've also talked about the subtleties of that. And, if you just take it strictly in the English version, okay, if you're going to accept the English, it says descendants of the giants. But, even if it means a cult of the Rapha, we know we've already shown how Rephaim are linked to these giant monsters anyway. So the point here, though, is when you look at the description of those men in the context of those phrases about descendants of the giants or Yelid HaRapha, it's the same language as of Goliath's armor. Ishbi in 2 Samuel 21, Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze and who was armed with a new sword thought to kill David, right? A little further on down, talks about the shaft of a spear who's like a weaver beam, which would be a Goliath, or that's a translational problem maybe there. But it says where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers. Again, he was a descendant from the giants. Then in 1 Chronicles 11, it's talking about Egyptian. These are all these giants who have sought after David. And it talks about an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits tall. So the phrase there, great stature, is clearly about height. 5 cubits tall comes to about 7 feet. The Egyptian had in his hand a spear like a weaver's beam. So you see these passages of these description of these giants who were hunting David, and it's using all the language that's common to Goliath, which again ties contextually. It ties that Rephaim to giants that we've been talking about, which are connected to the Nephilim. And the point there is just to say that these are passages that clearly talk about gigantic in nature, or in stature, in height. And again, it doesn't use the word Nephilim, fair enough, but it uses the word Rapha, which is the root of Rephaim. And we've already seen the passages where it talks about the Rephaim are connected to the Nephilim.
One of the objections I raised in the past to Goliath being a literal giant was that the oldest Hebrew text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Josephus, and the Septuagint put Goliath's height at 4 cubits in a span instead of 6 cubits in a span. 6 in a span would be like 9'6", something like that.
Something like that. Yeah.
4 in a span would be close to like 6'9", which is still really big when your average Israelite's like 5'3", 5'4". But
Exactly.
a scholar named Dr. Clyde Billington actually proposed a very elegant solution to this. He said, bear in mind, the average cubit varied depending on who was doing the measuring. So, we assume 18 inches, but if this, say if Goliath was being measured by a teenage Israelite by the name of David, who was maybe 5'4", that cubit might only have been like 15 inches. And so 6 cubits in a span, close to like 8 feet tall. But the royal cubit in Egypt, where the Septuagint translators were residing, was 22 inches. And so you go 6 cubits in a span there, that makes them like 11 feet tall. And they probably changed it to 4 cubits, this is Dr. Billington's conclusion, to make it equivalent to the smaller cubit common to the Hebrews in the time of David. And you still, with a 22-inch royal cubit at 4 cubits in a span, you still wind up with a guy who's a little under 8 feet tall, which is exceptionally large. And as Sharon has pointed out...
And that's what we mean by giants.
Exactly.
Right.
Not 20-footers.
Right.
To me, the 6'9" thing doesn't make really a lot of sense at all. I know that that's the position that Mike took, and a lot of people take it because of the Septuagint. But I've thought about this. It's like, okay, David's an average size Israelite, 5'5", and we know that Saul is a head taller than him, and that's why they picked him. Which is interesting because they wanted a king like all the other nations around, and so we want a really tall guy. Nothing to see there. Anyway. So that would put Saul at something like 6'6", probably. And so now I'm supposed to believe that the entire Israelite army, all of them, including 6'6" Saul, who's only 3 inches shorter than Goliath, is so terrified that nobody's going to go out there and do anything about this.
Fair enough.
The other thing to consider, and Sharon has pointed this out, and again, she's the smart one in our household, that there may have been some occult workings that caused some epigenetic changes to the Philistine giants. Now, this is sheer speculation because the text doesn't tell us this. Again, we do know that the Nephilim, the Rephaim, were venerated by the neighbors of Israel. As far away as Greece and Rome, they were still venerating these demigods, heroes of old. So believing that the Philistine giants who had connections to the Aegean were in some way venerating these demigod heroes is not out of the realm of possibility. Saul, when he was warning David not to go out there, 1 Samuel 17:33, doesn't even mention Goliath's size. Here's his line: "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." He's a trained killer, and you're not. It's possible that these guys were, if they were getting into this, the subtleties of the language there, Yalid ha-Rapha, if that does mean like a cult of the Rapha, they could have been demonically possessed or energized by these spirits in the way similar to the Viking berserkers. But again, that's speculation. But the bottom line here is that we know from the Bible and from the cultures around ancient Israel that gives some context to what the Hebrew prophets were going on about, was that these spirits of these entities were venerated and were sacrificed and worshipped by the neighbors of ancient Israel. And God made it very clear, don't do this. Psalm 128 said that the reason God sent the plague on the plains of Moab that killed 24,000 Israelites was that they were offering sacrifices to the dead.
It's a kind of a transition, Derek, to one of the last things I wanted to bring up, which is Isaiah 34 and Isaiah 13, two different verses in each passage that mention something that's related to this that I think is important to consider. So in those, even in some of the Hebrew, but also in the Septuagint, you get all kinds of different creatures like donkey centaurs and sirens and satyrs
Lilith.
and Lilith and hairy ones and the howlings and all this kind of stuff. And when you think about what those are, so those are really animal god hybrid sort of things. And what's so interesting is that the Septuagint uses the word demon as a catch-all here, but John uses the word demon as the way to explain the whole thing in Revelation 18. And the reason why I bring that up is because, these are not technically Nephilim in the sense that they're half human, half God, but they are of the same quality in terms of being half-breed creatures of mythology, and they're called demons. And it's into that we need to understand that, again, just like the sons of God was the universal understanding that we talked about last time in the church and with the Jews up until X period of time in both, they were a little different. The same thing is true of what the origin of a demon was. So where do these unclean spirits come from? Well, they come from the disembodied Nephilim. And all the church fathers said this. Like there was nobody who disagreed this up until point in time X, whatever that was. And so they're calling these animal creature hybrids and these human creature hybrids by the same name, demons. And the Bible speaks very specifically about that. And, you brought up earlier these passages in Proverbs and Isaiah 14 and stuff with the Rephaim. And those are this very demonic language that's going on there that's connected directly to the Rephaim. And so that's just one other way that you can get at this biblically. It's not in their embodied form, but it's in their disembodied form. And you have to take seriously that everybody in the church and all the Jews, this was their explanation for it. And you can't just wave it off with the brush of the hand and say, I'm not going to deal with it, because it is what it is.
It's interesting that they're called the men of renown, or the men of Shem, the men of, I've got to go back and look at the original original Hebrew there.
The men of the name, yeah.
Yeah, men of the name in Genesis 6, because one of the beliefs of the pagan neighbors of ancient Israel was that after your relatives died, your ancestors died, you had to keep calling them by name once a month to that kispum, that ritual meal where you fed them to sustain them in the afterlife. And there are some references in the Old Testament that hint at this, like in 2 Samuel 18:18, where Absalom builds a pillar for himself because he had no son to keep his name in remembrance. But in Isaiah 26, it is specifically mentioned, beginning at verse 13, O Lord our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone we bring to remembrance. They are dead, they will not live. They are Rephaim, they will not arise. To that end, you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. Basically, a polemic against this cult of the dead that surrounded ancient Israel. And it stems from Genesis chapter 6.
I think there's two things that the
good.
Bible, that the Old Testament is doing along the lines of the name and also the Gibborim. This is my opinion. And some scholars have seen this, and it's one of the reasons why I bring it up, that Noah has a son right after this whose name is Shem, and of course that means name. And so there's a word play that's going on, and you find that word play also at the Tower of Babel, where they want to make a name for themselves. So this is kind of the first place that you see this, where there's men of the name, and then at the Tower of Babel they want to make a name for themselves, and then Noah has a fellow named Shem, which means name, and it's out of that guy that God is going to come along and subvert the whole thing and make a name for himself. And then the same thing is going on with Gibborim, where you have these mighty men are called the Gibborim, and these are the heroes of old, and they're all supernaturally charged. But when you get to Joshua, what you find is that the Gibborim are actually the little Israelites who God says, I'm only want 300 of you, and you're going to wipe them all out, that kind of stuff. It's God's little men who actually become the mighty men in a flipping and a reversal of the thing. So both of those ideas are going on biblically, theologically in the text, that are word plays being used. And if you understand that both of these have their origins supernatural weirdness, I think it makes those word plays all the greater.
Well, and their neighbors knew about this theology as well, the name theology, because those Rephaim texts from Ugarit, they literally summon the Rephaim to the summit of Mount Hermon, to the threshing floor of El. And in the ancient world, threshing floors were considered portals between this realm and the next. The threshing floor of El, or the tabernacle of El, where the blessing of the name of El would revivify or resurrect the heroes. And according to the text, this is
a portal. Is this why the angel of the Lord comes to the threshing floor with David?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we've got a chapter titled Threshing Floors and Portals in our forthcoming book, The Gates of Hell.
There we go. See how
Sharon
I did that?
Did that one. Yes, thank you.
Promo.
Slam dunk. But yeah, and that
Wait,
same...
what? My book? What about my book? I've got giants in my book. Oh crud! My last book doesn't have giants, so oh well.
Well, yeah, just a serial killer, which is pretty good.
You should have changed your posters behind you there, Brian.
But that Rephaim text where they're coming to be revivified, that text literally has these Rephaim mounting their chariots and driving and arriving at the summit of Mount Hermon, the threshing floor of El, at dawn of the third day.
Huh.
Yeah.
Nice.
So, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ. Well, the giants of Genesis 6, you've been listening or watching the last hour, you get an idea of where we're coming from. If you're interested in the theology behind it, both Doug and Brian have condensed them very nicely into their books, Giants, Sons of the Gods. Brian's When Giants Were Upon the Earth. Sharon and I tackle it to a degree in Giants, Gods and Dragons. Judd Burton, who sadly couldn't be with us tonight, Nephilim, ethno-historical notes on the Nephilim, interview with the giant.
Absolutely.
Dig into all of that, or dig into Dr. Michael Heiser's work, Reversing Hermon, or The Unseen Realm, which is really foundational to all that we do. So we think we've got sound theology here for this weird belief, but as Mike used to say, if it's in the Bible and it's weird, it's probably important. So, Doug Van Dorn online, douglasvandorn.com, Brian Godawa, godawa.com. You'll find links to their websites in the notes. Guys, thanks very much, and we'll do this again next month. 2. Check the show notes below this video or audio, however you are consuming this podcast, for links to the websites for Brian Godawa, godawa.com, Doug Van Dorn, douglasvandorn.net, and Judd Burton. We'll put him in there, even though technical issues kept him out of the podcast. BurtonBeyond.net. He'll be back with us next month, God willing. And straight ahead, there is a substantial portion of voters who think that what happened in Pennsylvania last Saturday was all staged. Yes, staged. Bless their pointy little heads. And conferences to tell you about new ones. Idaho Falls and Branson, Missouri. We'll tell you more straight ahead on A View from the Bunker.
In the primeval history of Genesis, an ancient war began between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Eve. Fallen angels called Watchers begot a race of giants called Nephilim. Their goal, to stop the bloodline of the promised Messiah. But God had other plans. Chronicles of the Nephilim is a series of biblical novels by best-selling Christian author Brian Godawa, charting the rise and fall of the Watchers and the giants in the stories of the Bible and in between. Read them all. 8 supernatural novels, from Noah Primeval to Jesus Triumphant. Available in ebook, paperback, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Nephilim by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Giants, gods, dragons, they're all real. We may not see them with our natural eyes, but their handiwork is evident in what's happening in the world around us, the spiritual warfare taking place.
It is so true. It's obvious in Israel, but worldwide. Historically, we've seen this happen. And we want you to get excited about the Old Testament and the New, and the giants, gods, and dragons within it, because your kids need this information. So do you.
Yes. We're living in prophetic times. Help make sense of it with our special offer through July. Our book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, which takes a fresh look at end times prophecy. My book's Bad Moon Rising, about the spiritual forces behind Islam. And Last Clash of the Titans, the overlap between what we were told is Greek mythology and the Bible. And our DVD, based on the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. All of this, an $80 value for just $45 plus shipping and handling. Now through July, only at our online store, gilberthouse.org/store. Driving the internet to think every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online, vftb.net. All of our archives are there. You'll also find us at VFTB, gilberthouse.org. That's our web hub for everything that Sharon and I do. My personal website, derekpgilbert.com. Lots of excerpts from my books posted there to read for free. On social media, X, formerly Twitter, at ViewFromBunker, at GilbertHouse_TV, at Derek Gilbert. You'll also find us on Threads, Truth Social, Gab Me We Get Her, and Facebook, the Facebook page at View from the Bunker. You'll also find us on YouTube at Gilbert House. And if you're watching there, please click subscribe, smash that like button, click the bell for notifications, and then guarantee we never get canceled. You have the power. Download our app. That'll do it. gilberthouse.org/app. It's available for iOS, Android, Amazon Kindle Fire phones and tablets. Not only does it get you all of our video content and a Bible, audio Bible with multiple translations, it also adds you to the community. There's a little messaging section, little icon at the top right of the app there. It looks like a couple of word balloons. Click that. You can join the community there, ask us questions, ask for prayer, give prayer, comment on events of the day. Lots of different places there to connect with others of like mind. And again, this is all in the app, gilberthouse.org/app. Well, by now you know what took place in Butler County, Pennsylvania last Saturday. Going to be a little careful with my wording here because we just don't like to trigger those algorithms. But there are many questions as to how what happened actually happened. The big question in my mind is the Secret Service really that incompetent? There are some questions as to availability of personnel, because NATO had its 75th anniversary summit in Washington, D.C. last week. Week before last, leading up to the rally in Pennsylvania. And First Lady Jill Biden was at a campaign rally in January, or in Pittsburgh, rather. And so she was also protected by the Secret Service. So the question is whether the frontline guy agents were assigned to Trump's security detail. That's a question that'll hopefully be answered by congressional inquiry in the weeks ahead. Our Senator Josh Hawley here in Missouri reported that they actually drew people from Homeland Security's investigative team, HSI. In other words, not people who are normally used to guarding and protecting. They're used to investigating after the fact. So maybe that had something to do with it. Whatever, these are questions that will be asked and addressed by politicians. Certainly, there is some political hay to be harvested here by Republicans, and they probably will do that in the weeks ahead. But one of the disturbing bits of information that came out this past week, because of the iconic photos that were taken of President Trump shortly after the attempt, standing, bloodied, surrounded by Secret Service agents with the American flag in the background, fist defiantly raised. I mean, you could not have staged a better campaign photograph than that. Seriously. Which is why, according to a survey published late this week, 34% of Democrat voters think it was staged. They think the whole thing was fake. Now, that's ironic because liberals, progressives, are more likely to believe the official narrative than us conservatives. But because this one shows Donald Trump in a positive light, well, it can't be real. What is real is that 2 people were critically injured, and a Butler County, Pennsylvania firefighter, volunteer firefighter, former fire chief, Corey Comparator, was killed, in addition to the shooter, Thomas Matthew Crooks. So, I mean, how lacking in empathy do you need to be to suspect that something like this was completely staged simply for a campaign photo op? What little regard must you have for Donald Trump and for those who voted for him in the 2 previous elections, those who support him in this election, to believe that he would be capable of something this heinous, staging this event that resulted in 2 deaths and 2 others critically injured? This is how divided America is right now in 2024, and it's why I believe it's unlikely this union survives the 21st century. If the Lord tarries, I don't believe the United States will be a single political entity by 2024, certainly not in the form that it is now. And to that 1/3 of Democrat voters who think that last weekend was nothing more than a photo op, bless your pointy little heads. We're going to be in Dayton, Ohio next week, so there will be no PID radio, no Gilbert House Fellowship next weekend. I may get a View from the Bunker episode out if I can edit it in advance. I'm still working on my presentation for the conference next weekend, which will deal with the secret history of the founding of modern Israel. This is another conspiracy theory. This one, well, I won't dive too deep into this. I've talked about this on the program here recently, say with Mike Spalding, and our friend Mark Sutherland in the UK had me on his program here recently to discuss the history of modern Israel and the fact that the Rothschild family really had very little to do with it. Seriously. I mean, look, I wear a tinfoil hat, so I am fully aware that the official narrative is almost always untrue. But what's fascinating about modern Israel is when you dig into the hidden history of what really led to the Declaration of Independence on May 14th of 1948, is how far it is from the conspiracy theories that it was all an Illuminati plot or something. It really wasn't. Yes, there were a lot of underhanded things happening in the shadows that the players involved would prefer to keep in the shadows. But they were generally stacked against Israel rather than for the creation of Israel. And I would think that if the God of this world, Satan, had really intended to create Israel as a trap to lure in unsuspecting, credulous Christians, probably wouldn't have been as much support, or rather as much opposition as there was to modern Israel. So anyway, I'm working on trying to boil this down to a 1-hour presentation, because I could probably take 3 or 4 hours to go into all of the various things that were going on behind the scenes. And there just isn't time for that. And frankly, nobody would stay awake that long. But if I can get through all of that, there will be a View from the Bunker next weekend. Otherwise, we'll just take that week off and then return the following weekend. The speakers next weekend, if you're going to be with us in Dayton, we really look forward to seeing you there. This is a wonderful gathering. Pastor Mike Spalding, Dr. Mike Spalding, has done an excellent job of bringing together L.A. Marzulli, Pastor Paul Begley, Dr. Greg Reed. Boy, you want to hear him talk on spiritual warfare, because he's lived it. He has lived it. Tom Dunn, likewise. Pastor Carl Gallups will be there, one of the most dynamic preachers. Well, him and Paul Begley both. Two of the most dynamic preachers in America today. Dr. Sherry Tenpenny will be speaking. Dr. Judd Burton via video. And, of course, the fellowship behind the scenes, that is worth being there in person if you can get there. It's at the Harvest Revival Center in Brookville, Ohio. That's just outside Dayton. If you cannot be there, then please take advantage of the streaming video, because the conference, the information that's coming together from these speakers is really going to be a blessing, I think. You can find out more and register at gothereforeconference.com. gothereforeconference.com. In September, I'll be at the Pitchfork and Hoe Gathering in Valley City, North Dakota. This will be at the Eagles Club in Valley City, working on a couple of presentations for that weekend as well. Had a great time there last year, and they invited me back. So North Dakota being the land of my ancestors, my mother's side of the family immigrated there, late 19th century Germans who had moved from Germany to what was then Russia, now part of Ukraine, under the program started by Catherine the Great, continued by her son and grandson, then discovered that it wasn't so great there after all when the Russians started conscripting the Germans into the Russian army. Wound up in the Dakotas. So looking forward to going back to Valley City, North Dakota, September 6th and 7th. And there's more information at the Facebook page for the Pitchfork and Hoe Gathering, and I hope to see you there. Sharon will be speaking at the Ignite Your Fire Conference from Hear the Watchman in Idaho Falls, Idaho. This is October 4th through 6th. It'll be at the Holiday Inn and Suites at Idaho Falls. There's a hotel shuttle. So if you want to fly into Idaho Falls, just take the shuttle to the hotel and join us there for that weekend. Sharon, one of the featured speakers, along with Vicki Joy Anderson, Tracy Tennant, Heidi Begley, and more. You can find out more and sign up online at hearthewatchmen.com, hearthewatchmen.com. Then in Branson, we will be at the Christmas in Branson Prophecy Conference from Prophecy Watchers. An honor to join that team once again, and this is a wonderful facility, the Chateau on the Lake in Branson, December 5th through 8th of 2024. L.A. Marzulli, Bill Salas, Ken Johnson, Billy Crone, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis, Mondo Gonzalez, and Josh Peck of Prophecy Watchers, and yours truly. I will be speaking there, probably going to talk about Psalm 68 and the prophecy of God's final battle with Leviathan, chaos. I think that's what I'm going to talk about. So anyway, time to figure that out, but we hope you join us there. And you can find out more and register at prophecywatchers.com. And there's also another website there. What is the URL for that one? It is, I had it brought up over here. There we go. Branson Christmas Prophecy Conference.com. Branson Christmas Prophecy Conference.com. Again, December 5th through 8th. And we hope to see you there. We'll be back in Israel actually twice. We are now planning to go back in November, another solidarity mission with Israel, a one-week tour. We will go to areas attacked by Hamas on October 7th of last year, areas in the south like Sderot, possibly Ofakim, certainly the Nova Music Festival site once again. We'll go to Tel Aviv, Hostage Square, probably make another visit to the Shiva Rehabilitation Hospital, visit with wounded IDF soldiers, and then in Jerusalem, of course, the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives, the City of David, and other locations still to be determined. We will probably also go to Gush Etzion, which was the site of a key battle during Israel's war for independence in 1948. Very powerful presentation there. So you can find out more at our website, gilberthouse.org/travel, gilberthouse.org/travel. And again, our Israel tour next spring, March 25th through April 3rd, with Doug Van Dorn, Timothy Alberino, and Dr. Judd Burton as our special guests. Don't miss out on that one. God willing, if peace returns, and we pray that it will be so by next spring, we'll visit sites that just are not on the itineraries of other tours. Gilgal, Rephaim, other megalithic sites that nobody seems to know about, that point to a cult of the dead, and perhaps sites constructed by the Rephaim in ancient times. Why do we say that? Well, because, for example, Gilgal Rephaim, they estimate up to 65,000 tons of stone was moved to create that site. Compare that to Stonehenge, less than 2,000 tons. 65,000 tons, 2,000 tons. Gilgal Rephaim should be much better known than it is. And there's another site overlooking the Jordan River, on the bank of the Jordan River, within 2 miles of the Sea of Galilee. In fact, less than half a mile from ancient Bethsaida, the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, the first 3 apostles called. Coincidence? We think not. More information at gilberthouse.org/travel. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen, as the case may be. If you're watching, again, at YouTube, thank you. Subscribe, share, and then download our mobile app. If you're listening, whether you've subscribed at Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, wherever fine podcasts are sold, again, thank you. Thank you. If you got a spare moment, we'd sure appreciate a good review. Give us a like at Facebook, and tip of the headphones, or earbuds, as the case may be, to our inimitable announcer, DC Good. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That gets harder and harder to say the older I get. Anyway, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is A View from the Bunker.